Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Kamma Daf Ayin Ches, Bava Kamma 78. And we're going to start on 78a, 9 lines from the top. Gemara has said that Rava had a statement, Zeh Bana'av. This is a halachic statement. That wherever it says in the Torah, Seh, Eino Elo Lahutzi Es HaKlayim. It's coming to tell us that it does not refer to Klayim. Now, the Gemara had said on 77b that Rava had said the statement to say that if you steal kolayim, you steal a cross of a sheep and a goat, which is what we call a shot or a geep. If you steal such an animal and then you sell it or slaughter it, you're not liable to the punitive damages. But the Gemara said, actually, Rava's statement does not apply to that. So if that's the case, the Gemara wants to know, what does Rava's statement apply to? What's Rava saying the statement with respect to? If it's to tell us that you cannot bring such an animal as a carbon, it's explicit in the verse. We don't need Rava to teach it to us. It says in the pasuk, Shor o chesed prat l'klayim, an ox or a sheep you bring as a carbon. This excludes klayim. Ila meiser, if it's a case of meiser behema, which is that you have to bring the 10th animal as a carbon, and then the bailim get to eat it, the owners get to eat it. Well, that we know it does not apply to a shot or a geep, because it says tachas yof mikachim. We learn out a from meiser behema to kachim from the word tachas, and ilu bechor, if it's to tell us that the firstborn animal of a sheep, of a shot or a geep, is not brought as a firstborn carbon given to the kohen, havara yolav mimaiser. We learn that out by comparing it to meiser, or inami, or else alternatively we learn it out from the love of nidmeh. That a nidmeh is a mutant animal. An animal gives birth to a mutant. Amrislo. There, if the firstborn is a nidmeh, we might think that we have to bring it as a carbon. We say we don't, because it says ach b'chor shor, achiyahu shor ub'chor shor. They both need to be an ox. It's an ox, and its offspring is an ox. So kolayim ibayis. So for sure, if it's a kolayim, it's not brought as a firstborn. So if that's the case, Rava's teaching that it's coming to exclude kolayim. What's the context of Rava's teaching? The context of Rava's teaching is a peter chamor. Context of Rava's teaching is a firstborn donkey. That's the context of Rava's teaching, that if you have an animal that's a firstborn male donkey, you need to kill it, or else you can redeem it by giving the kohen a seh. I might think you could give a shot or a geep. That's what Rava's coming to tell us. That you can't. Kedetzanan, ein podin, lo be'egel, lo b'chaya, lo b'shluta, lo b'treifa, lo b'koyim, lo b'koy. That according to the Mishnah, you cannot redeem this firstborn donkey. You cannot redeem this firstborn donkey with any of the following animals. You cannot redeem this firstborn donkey with a calf, with a undomesticated animal, with a slaughtered animal, with a treifa, or with a koyim. So Rava is basically just restating what the Mishnah has taught us. So the Gemara is, or not with a koy. A koy is an animal if we're not sure if it's a behem or chaya. Gemara says, well, Rabbi Elazar demater b'koyim. According to Rabbi Elazar, who allows koyim, he allows you to redeem a firstborn animal with koyim. Gemara is not telling us that Rabbi is challenging Rabbi Elazar, because Rabbi Elazar is a Tana, and so therefore he argues with the binyan of Rav. But since Rava said a binyan av from Seh, meaning to say, he says the word Seh is extra. So the Gemara wants to know, what does Rabbi Elazar learn out from this extra word Seh? So according to Rebbe Lazar, who allows you to redeem koyim, now Rebbe Lazar mater mekoyim meshu seh. So Rebbe Lazar allows you to redeem the firstborn donkey with this shoat or the geep because it's a lamb. So if that's the case, why is the word seh written extra in the Torah? So it's to tell us meaning to say, the Rabbi had said the word seh, every time it appears, it's excluding kolayim. If that's the case, but Rabbi Lazar says that you can redeem the firstborn donkey with kolayim. So according to Rabbi Lazar, what's the word seh in this pasuk coming to teach us? Amrocha Rabbi Lazar ki idmar derava letame shenoad minatahor. The buro minatame. Talking about a case of a non-kosher animal, and that became kosher of a kosher animal that gave birth to a non-kosher animal, and it became impregnated from a non-kosher animal. Rashi gives the example of a horse that impregnates a cow, and it gives birth to a horse. And that such an animal is not kosher. Udalok Rabbi Yoshua, because Rabbi Yoshua learns it out from someplace else. The Rabbi Yoshua misek savim v'seizim nafka achiei aviv keves v'imo kivsa. Because according to Rabbi Yoshua, you learn out from the fact that it says that you can eat a sheep from the ksavim, or a sheep or a lamb from the goats. So this teaches us that you need to have the father and the mother both being kosher. So then the Gemara asks the question, meaning to say, if one of them is not kosher, you can't eat from it. So the Gemara asks a general question: Utahora mitama. Utahora mitama mima abra. Can really a kosher animal, like the scenario we described, this cow become impregnated from? Can really a kosher animal become impregnated from a non-kosher animal? The Gemara says yes, it can. The kaimelan, because we have a principle. The abar mikalot karebi Shimon. We have a principle of the following case: the abar mikalot, that we know that the mother was kosher, but the father was born from a kosher animal. When it was mutated, it had basically non-split hooves, so its hooves were webbed, and so therefore it has only one of the simanim of the kosher animal. It comes from the kosher animal, but it doesn't have the signs of the kosher animal, and so that animal then impregnated a kosher animal, and so that's the situation. Rashi says, Rabbi Shimon Karile Tame. Rabbi Shimon calls such an animal kosher. That Rabbi Shimon's other position, even if this animal was born from a cow, but since it's born without the simanim, it's going to be non-kosher. And that's the scenario that we're referring to here. This raises the whole question. Let's say you could take a cow and genetically modify it in the laboratory so that it's born without split hooves. Would that be a kosher animal or not? So according to Rabbi Shimon, it would not. It has to have the simanim. So by Rava, now Rava asked the following question. Arei ola. Let's say you have an ola offering. V'hifresh shor. Let's say you have an ola offering and you separate an ox. Now, an ola could be brought from a sheep or an ox. So you separate the ox to fulfill your vow to bring an ola. Uba achar, and someone else comes. V'ganav, and this other person who comes steals your ox that you'd separated for your ola. Mi pater ganav navshe bekeves. Now, Rabbanan. So can the thief, according to the Rabbanan who say that if you take a vow in general, you just have to bring a sheep, can he just pay this person back with a sheep? Or ba'ola sa'of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, or according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, says if you make just a general vow of a bird, then can he just give a bird to compensate the person for stealing his ox, which was an oah? The Tanan Harei oah. Let's say a person says, "I have to bring an oah." Yavi keves. He brings a sheep. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "Yavi tor." He brings a toro ben a bird. No, my, do we say mi amrin and shame oah kibo elai, that the person who took this vow initially, he just accepted upon himself to bring an oah? Odoma matzi amalei ana mitzvah min amuvchar, but or maybe he could say, "I wanted to do this mitzvah in the best way possible." Mitzvah min amuvchar ba'ino miyavid. I want to do it in the best way possible. I separated an ox, and so therefore that's what you need to pay me back. Basar di baye, after he raised this question, hadar pashta, he answered it. Ganav pater atzmon bekeves. That if a person steals an animal and designated an ox for it, he can exempt himself with a sheep according to the Rabbanan, or ba'oas ofo Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He only has to pay back the value of what the person was obligated to give, not the actual thing that the person had separated. Rav Acha he says explicitly, Amarava Re'alai Oah. Person says, I'm going to bring an Oah, the hit for sure, and he designated an ox, and somebody else stole it. Potter Atzmon Bekeves or Abanan Ba'os for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he can exempt himself with a sheep according to Rabbanan or an oah according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The Maharam Mint says, we see from here that if a person buys a very fancy esrog and somebody else steals it and destroys it, the person only has to pay him back a regular esrog. Just like here, he only has to pay him back a sheep and not the ox. But the Chacham Tzvi says, no, an esrog is different. It's a commodity. You could sell it. Unlike the korban, which you can't sell. Let's say, so now we go that if a person steals a sheep or an ox and then sells it or slaughters it, he has to pay 4 or 5 times the amount. Let's say he doesn't sell it entirely. He sells everything except for 1%. Or he had a partnership in it. Or if he slaughters it and became a carcass, or if he stabbed it, or if he ripped out the simanim, he didn't slaughter it properly. Misham Tashlumi Kefal, he only pays double. He doesn't pay the 4 or 5 times penalty. My chutzmi echad mimeyash. But what does it mean with the exception of 1/100th? Amarav chutzmi davar haniter imo vishlita. So Rav says with the exception of something that will become permitted to him with the slaughter. If he sells 1% of the meat, if he sells 99% of the meat but holds back 1% of the meat, then it's not considered a sale to punish him to pay the penalty. Levi says, Chutz migizo sale. Levi says, even if he sells everything except for the shearings, which are not necessarily something that's permitted by the sheep, he's not going to be responsible for the penalty. It's considered a shiur. He's left something over. Tanya b'masni. So chutz migizo sale. So too, if a brisa, with the exception of the shearings, you wouldn't pay the penalty. Meisvei, so the Gemara challenges Rav's position. It says, Melchor chutz mi yada, chutz mi ragla, chutz mi karna, chutz mi gizoseh, einu misham tashlumi arba chamisha. It says if he sold it with the exception of its hand, its legs, its horns, or its shearings, he doesn't pay the penalty. So that's a direct contradiction to Rav. Whereas Rabbi says, "Davar ma'akev b'shlita enu misham tashlumi arba v'chamisha. She'enu ma'akev b'shlita misham tashlumi arba v'chamisha." If he sells it with the exception of something which the slaughter needs in order to be a kosher shlita, then it's not going to be a valid. Then it's not going to pay the penalty. But if it's not something which is required to make it a kosher shlita, then it will be a valid. Then I'll have to pay the penalty. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, "Chutz mikarno," with the exception of the horns. Then he wouldn't pay Eino Misham Tashlumi Arba Chamisha. Then he wouldn't pay the penalty. But Chutz Mikizoseh, with the exception of the shearings, Misham Tashlumi Arba Chamisha. Then he'd pay the penalty. So Bishlama makes sense. Levi Tana Kamma. Levi like the position of Tana Kamma, with the exception of that. Even if you say I'm selling with the exception of the shearings, you have to pay the penalty. Hello, Rav. Come on, Amri. Who is Rav like? So Amri, Rav the Amar Ki Tana. Rav's like the following Tana. The Tanya of Shimon ben Elazar says, Machar Chutz. If you say I'm selling it with the exception of the hand or the foot, you don't pay the penalty. Chutz mikarna, chutz mikizoseh, but if, with the exception of the horns, misham tashlumi arachamisha. So, but with the exception of the horns or the shearings, you do pay it. So, b'mai kamiflagi, what's the dispute between the Tana Kamma and this version of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? The dispute is Tana Kamma savar tevacho, that he slaughters it. Cool, but you need to slaughter the whole thing. Mecharo, cool, but you need to sell the whole thing. Rabbi savar tevacho. When it says you slaughter, it's something that you need for the slaughter. To exclude is something which is not requiring a slaughter, like the shearings or the horns. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar savar karna delo migzakaim. He says the horns, which are not ever supposed to be cut off, if you sell them, selling them with the exception of the horns, that's a shear. Then you left something over. And you wouldn't pay the penalty. But the shearings, that those are there to be sheared off, the law of a shear. That's not like you held something back. Then it's not something you held something back. You paid the fifth, the 4 and the 5 feet. And the second Tana Debei Rabbi Shimon Elazar, who we say Rav is like Savar Yada v'Ragav Ditzruchei Tevicha, the hands and the legs which require slaughter have a shear. Then if you didn't sell that, that's considered like you held something back. You don't pay the penalty. But the shearings and the horns, the load tzrichei tvicha, they don't require shearings. Lo have a shear. That's not considered like you held something back. So Gemara says, "Kasha to Reb Shimon Elazar, Adir Shimon and Elazar." So this is like a contradiction between the two positions of Reb Shimon and Elazar. They don't both say the same thing. One is exactly like Rav, and the other one says with the exception of the horns, but not with the exception of the shearings. So the Gemara says, Trei Tanai, Aliba, the Trei Tanai, Aliba, the Reb Shimon Elazar. There's two Tanaim arguing with Reb Shimon Elazar says. Tan Rabbanan, Hagonev, somebody who steals Hakitas, somebody who steals an animal that's missing a leg, Vesachigeres, or an animal that's limping, Mesasuma, or a blind animal, or if you steal an animal that's owned by partners, chayiv. You have to pay the 4 or 5 time penalty. Mishutfim sheganvu peturim. But if there are partners who steal, then they're going to be exempt. Gemara says, we have a different source which says if partners steal, you're liable. One is a partner who steals from his friend. So if it's a partner who steals from his friend, then he didn't steal the whole thing, so then he doesn't pay the penalty. But if partners steal it in general from the world, then they have to pay. I might think we have a contradiction because Rav Nachman says, I might think if a partner steals from his friend, or partners that steal in general will be obligated. You need to steal the whole thing, to slaughter the whole thing. And because in the case of the shutfin, you're only stealing half of it. So I'm a Rav Nachman Lokasha. So Rav Nachman says it's not a difficulty. If the partner steals it with his friend's consent and he slaughters it with his friend's consent, then he's going to have to pay the 4 or 5 times penalty. But if he does without his friend's consent, he doesn't pay the penalty. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, let's say he sells it for the exception of 30 days, the exception of, he says, I'm selling to you except you can't do this type of work with it. I'm selling to accept its fetus. Mahu. What will be the law? According to one who says that the fetus is basically like a limb of the animal of the mother, then it's not a question of shear, but he obviously held something back, so you're not liable for the penalty. It's only a question according to one that says the fetus is not a leg of the animal. What would we say there? Would we say given the mechubar ba haveshi, or would we say that since the fetus since the fetus is connected to it, it's like you held something back. Or since the fetus is supposed to eventually go out, you haven't held something back. Or alternatively, so alternatively, since we say that since it's not the limb, it's not, you didn't hold anything back. Or do we say that since the fetus is going to be something that's permitted when the mother is slaughtered, therefore, command the shire begufadami. It's like you held something essential back from the animal. So the Gemara says, take it. We leave this question unresolved. Let's say a person steals it, then cuts off the limb, and then he sells it. And do we say that which he stole, he didn't sell? Or do we say, no, what he sold, he didn't leave anything over? Gemara leaves the question unresolved. All right, we'll stop the recording here, but we could go on for a few more minutes.